Craig?
Oh, it's pretty easy. You just literally invite it, and then right in the chat, you tell it what to do. So you just invite. Yeah,
Did you
it's.
want to run it?
I think it's. Yeah, sure. Let's see.
Because if I do it, it'll start showing up on the stream.
Okay, I put it in there. It's under check this out.
I guess I need to post the link. And am I hosting today?
I did it last time, and my voice is kind of crap today, so.
I can't host it.
I didn't pick what articles here. Let me scroll back up. Unless you just want to do ad hoc.
Oh no, pick them. It'll make my life easier. Then I'll just
Okay.
take whatever you guys don't want.
Last time, my voice is kind of crap today, so.
I didn't pick what articles here. Let me scroll.
All right. Now, Telegram. I should open Telegram. Okay. Announcement. I do not have permissions to type into me.
Yeah, I think whatever they call it, what's the back end for this thing? They've updated it because I noticed there's a setting for following the editor. If you uncheck that, allegedly where you're typing is not going to make me jump to where you're typing. Because remember that was a problem before?
Mm-hmm.
Allegedly that they were supposed to fix that.
Which was why Moss was so popular there for a while.
Is if you click on your name, because we have me, Eric, Joe, and Joe, so we have double the Joe. Double
Yeah,
the pleasure.
I'm logged in too.
But if you click on one of the names, or not names, but one of the icon things, at the bottom it says always follow the editor. You make sure that's unchecked, and it shouldn't jump around. Let's see, we got Linux Mint released. All right.
Decently long, but not a lot of them.
Parallels can finally run. Okay. German router maker. Yeah, making the titles a little bit.
Yeah, I couldn't see the transition or part of
Me
the
either. I scrolled past 2 articles. And I'm like,
bumping it up to
14. All right, where's 14? Okay, that one's done. And Linux Mentzia. Oh, come on. 14. Okay, I got the first 2. What else do we got here? So we've got
first one is pretty short since
2, 3. We got 3 stories, 3 news. How about Eric?
4.
If Eric's not wanting to speak as
4
much,
and 1 news.
we can have him do the first.
Put whatever you want. Yeah, whatever you want me to do is fine.
Well, a lot of these are extremely long.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, I should be fine reading an article if you just want to split it up evenly. Whatever.
Okay.
I'll give you the
If
apple
I have to,
silicone
I'll just
one.
mute.
It's not as long as some of the other ones.
Got
Yeah,
it.
it's just
Yeah, if I have to, I will. I'll just mute and cough.
okay. I was
So that
just being
leaves you to
considerate.
pick, Eric, between Google and German router maker.
Sorry. It doesn't matter.
I can do either one.
And take the German router maker.
All right.
I will take the Love Club.
The Love Club.
Nice.
And
Sounds like a swingers.
we'll give Eric
The
Microsoft Patches Windows.
Love Club.
Also a shorter order.
Okay.
Privacy. Weekly wanderings. And the innards.
And 2 concurrent viewers. I view. Okay, it looks like I have a lot of notes. Trimmed it back. Okay. But do you have Craig when it's Craig thing?
I will do it now.
Sure that I have the settings to only show.
Now recording.
Awesome.
Craig is Craiging
Right.
like only Craig can.
Only use it for one thing. I need it. Bam. No more edges. All right. And this doesn't do separate streams, so what, 1, 2, 3, and then 20 seconds of silence?
Yeah, I think he still wanted to have that. I'm pretty sure Craig handles most of that, but he still had us do it last time just to, I guess, capture a background
Yeah,
level.
And we're not doing a local recording. We're just using Craig.
that is correct.
Yeah, just using
Okay.
Craig.
Suppose well, YouTube acts as the backup. You do have a
Okay.
primary and a backup. Otherwise, I'd be recording from OBS just to make sure. All right, so 1, 2, 3 in silence. 1, 2, 3. All right, we're far enough in that we can actually start swearing where it won't get picked up by the algorithms.
Nice.
Was that a
Well,
Red Dwarf reference? It felt like a Red.
oh, it's just the UK
Okay.
equivalent of like a middle finger.
Schmeg.
That was a
It's
Red
more
Dwarf
from
reference.
yeah,
I
that
haven't
was
watched-
more from young ones. But,
Oh,
yeah.
young.
Evidently, you haven't watched enough Red Dwarf.
I haven't.
You
I
need to watch
haven't.
all
I
of it.
watched some. Yeah, I haven't watched.
It's
I don't know.
been
I kind of. Yeah.
probably been 7, 10 years since I've seen it, but I
Really?
watched. Yeah, I remember it. I watched years of it from when it started. I just haven't watched any recently. I need to brush up on it because that was a good show.
Well, they had new seasons a couple of years ago that were actually pretty good.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Wow.
I suppose we should kick this pig. Oh, it's over to me then, right?
Let me make sure I have Control M here working. Did you hear me?
No. Did you hear me?
Okay.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Perfect. My
Now I
mute
can.
is working.
Yep.
All right. Welcome to mintCast, the podcast by the Linux Mint community for all users of Linux. This is episode 453. This is episode 453.5, recorded on Sunday, January 19th, 2025. Freezing again, I'm Joe.
Is it spring yet? I'm Dale.
And starting off 2025 slowly, I'm Eric.
First up in the news, Linux Mint 22.1 Xaya released. Parallels can finally run x86 versions of Linux on Apple Silicon. German router maker is latest company to inadvertently clarify the LGPL license. Google and Linux Foundation form Chromium Love Club. Love those words together, Love Club. In security and privacy, Microsoft patches Windows to eliminate secure boot bypass threat. And in our wanderings, Joe enjoys preparing his rack, Dale does routing, and Eric shares 80s kids culture with his kids. In our innards section, a look at Docker. And finally, the feedback and a couple of suggestions. Please remember, if you want to follow along with our discussion, the full show notes for this episode are linked in the show's description. First up in the news, Linux Mint 22.1 Xaya released. From the Linux Mint blog via Londoner, on Thursday, January 16th, Clem and the team released the latest stable version of Linux Mint. This is 22.1, codename Xaya. We discussed all the new features and the changes from Mint 22 in our last episode, 452. If you are running the beta, you don't need to upgrade. Use the update manager to apply all the latest available updates. Upgrade instructions for those currently using Linux Mint 22 were published yesterday, January 17th, in the Mint blog, link in the show notes. You should also check out what's new and the releases and the release notes. Links in the show notes. Eric, you're up.
Sorry about that. It was definitely not potato chipping. Not at all. All right. Parallels can finally run x86 versions of Linux on Apple Silicon. This is from Ars Technica. And please note, while this article mentions Windows, it does have some implications for using Linux on Apple Silicon. Virtualization software like Parallels and VMware Fusion gave Mac owners the ability to run Windows and Linux on top of macOS, but for Apple Silicon Macs, that support was limited to the ARM-based versions of those operating systems. And while Windows and Linux both support some level of x86 to ARM app translation that attempts to maintain compatibility with most software, there are still plenty of things that demand an Intel or AMD processor with the x86 instruction set. Last week, Parallels released a new update that partially resolves this problem. Users of Parallels Desktop Pro 20.2.0 now have access to x86 operating systems via an early technology preview of Parallels' proprietary emulation engine. The technology preview is currently limited to a certain 64-bit versions of Windows 10, Windows 11, and Windows Server 2019 and 2022. Parallels also says it has tested several UEFI-compatible Linux distributions, including Ubuntu 2204.5, Kubuntu 2404.1, Lubuntu 2404.1, and Debian versions 12.4 and 12.8. Fedora will install, but it's unstable. 32-bit versions of operating systems as well as older versions of Windows like Windows 7 and 8 aren't supported. For Windows 11 and supported Linux distros, you can run existing virtual machines from the technology preview, but you can't set up new ones. Useful for anyone migrating from an Intel Mac with virtual machines they'd like to keep. If you're trying to set up a new virtual machine, the only officially supported operating systems are Windows Server 2022 and Windows 10 21H2, though there are workarounds available for Windows 10 22H2 and Windows Server 2019. You won't be able to set up fresh copies of Windows 11 and some versions of Linux, or some versions of Linux, because the technology preview doesn't support SSE 4.2, additional CPU instructions that became common in Intel and AMD processors in the early 2010s. This also means that Windows 11 24H2 VMs are entirely unsupported since the 24H2 update requires these CPU instructions to work at all. Parallels notes that these operating systems currently run really slow due to the overhead required for translation. Windows takes between 2 and 7 minutes to boot, depending on the speed of your Mac, and the responsiveness of the operating system is low. Rather than attempting to multitask, Parallels says you should close the app you're using before trying to open another one. Yeehaw. That sounds like fun. Other limitations include a lack of USB pass-through support, no sound support for just one virtual CPU core, and 8 gigs of RAM. A lack of support for nested virtualization, which could affect compatibility with features like Windows Subsystem for Linux. Parallels also says that translation overhead requires a lot of system resources. For example, an Intel-based Windows 10 VM with 4 gigs of RAM assigned will take 8 gigs of your Mac's memory. Wow. While Apple's Rosetta 2 generally does a good job of running Intel Mac apps on Apple Silicon Macs, Apple doesn't support running entire x86 operating systems using Rosetta. The virtualization framework built into Mac OS likewise only supports ARM-compatible operating systems. Though limited, parallel support for running x86 operating systems is a unique feature that other companies haven't been able to offer yet. It's also a bit of a blast from the past for longtime Mac users. Back in the PowerPC days, Mac owners also had to rely on third-party emulators like Connectic's Virtual PC for running x86-based operating systems and apps. Do you guys
I'm not
use
seeing the good in
anything like this?
No, I don't use Mac hardware.
I think that it's the type of thing where, as they're saying, you wouldn't want to multitask. Like, you're not going to be using this as an interactive desktop. This is going to be, I need to fire this up to do one thing that I can't possibly do on a Mac or something else. So I'm going to suffer through the 20 minutes it takes me to do that one thing, and then shut the machine down and get on with my life. I think that's really the only value of something like this.
Okay. Doesn't sound like something I'm
All right,
going to
Dale.
use.
No, I don't think any of us are, but it is interesting to see when they break new ground, and particularly because this transition from x86 to ARM is now also going to be something that we have to see more of beyond just Apple Silicon, right? We're seeing more of those processors being released for other operating systems. Copilot.
I'm still holding out hope for the Asahi project to get something more of a robust offering, because I know, like Linus Torvalds, he's been running it on, I believe, on Fedora on his whatever Mac he has, and I know there's others in the community that are using it. But as far as like I said, robustness, and I was in my car, not too much this week, been hibernating, but because Northeast Ohio weather sucks in the winter. But I was listening to the Off the Cuff and Leo, they were talking about Macs and stuff, and that's one thing that Leo was talking about when I just went to the grocery store like an hour or two ago. He was saying one of the bugs that they had to work out was the sound driver could blow, or the sound driver could damage the speakers if you raise the volume too high or some type of function. And I agree with him that yep, that's a lot of nope. Not gonna buy a $3,000 laptop and then raise the volume and blew the speakers. So
Okay. Ready for the next one, Dale?
yes, let me scroll down there. German router maker is latest company to inadvertently clarify the LGPL license from Ars Technica. The GNU public license, also known as GPL, and its lesser version, LGPL, were widely known and used. Still, every so often, a networking hardware maker has to get sued to make sure that everyone knows how it works. Yeah, I can see how that works. The latest such router company to face legal repercussions is AVM, a Berlin-based maker of the popular home networking products in Germany. Sebastian Steck, a German software developer, bought an AVM Fritzbox 4020 and being a certain type requested the source code that had been used to generate certain versions of the firmware on it. According to Steck's complaint, translated to English and provided in the PDF by the Software Freedom Conservancy, he needed this code to recompile a networking library and some logging to determine which programs on the Fritzbox established connections to servers on the internet, which data they send. But Steck was also concerned about AVM's adherence to GPL version 2 and LGPL version 2.1 licenses, under which the Fritz OS and various libraries were licensed. The SFC, Software Freedom Conservancy, states that it provided at grant to Steck to pursue the words are hard to pursue the matter. AVM provided source code, but it was incomplete, as the scripts for compilation and installation were missing. According to Steck's complaint, this included makefiles and details on environment variables like kernel_layout necessary for compilation. Steck notified AVM. AVM did not respond, and Steck sought legal assistance, ultimately including the SFC. Months later, according to the SFC, AVM provided all the relevant source code and scripts, but the suit continued. AVM ultimately paid Steck's attorney fees. The case proved once again that not only are source code requirements real, but the LGPL also demands freedom despite its lesser name, and that source code needs to be useful in making real changes to firmware, in German courts at least. And this is a quote. The favorable result of this lawsuit exemplifies the power of copyleft, granting users the freedom to modify, repair, and secure the software on their own devices. End quote. The SFC said in a press release, in another quote, companies like AVM received these immense benefits themselves. This lawsuit reminded AVM that downstream users must receive those very same rights under copyleft, end quote. As noted by the SFC, the case was brought in July of 2023, but as is typical with German law, no updates on the case could be provided until after its conclusion. SFC posted its complaint documents and the source code ultimately provided by AVM and encouraged the company to publish its own documents since those are not automatically public in Germany. Doris Haar, a spokesperson for AVM, noted that the company has, quote, supported the active open source community from the very beginning as it ensures long-term innovation, end quote. Haar pointed to projects like Fretz and source code offerings. AVM also takes issue with the FSC's framing of the case, quote, in the course of the proceedings, it turned out that the source code was sufficient, which is why the opposing party withdrew all allegations of potential LGPL and GPL violation, end quote. Haar wrote to ours, the decision, quote, not a judgment in German, der Beschluss, I think that's how you pronounce it, confirmed an amicable settlement, and AVM, quote, voluntarily decided to cover the cost, end quote, according to Haar. Both parties could have chosen to appeal the decision, Haar wrote. In this case, too, is the quote, we actively supported the plaintiff's side in advance, which unfortunately nevertheless led to the legal proceedings, which were closed in July of 2024, end quote. Are copyleft lawsuits against router and other networking hardware makers common? Just check the FSF Europe's wiki list of GPL lawsuits and negotiations. Many or most of them involve networking gear that made ample use of the free source code and then failed to pay it back and offering the same to others. At the top is perhaps the best known case in tech circles, the Linksys WRT54G conflict from 2003. While the matter was settled before a lawsuit was filed, negotiations between Linksys owners, Cisco, and a coalition led by the Freedom Software Foundation, publisher of the GPL and LGPL, made history. It resulted in the release of all the modified and relevant GPL source code used in its hugely popular blue and black router. The backstory, such as it exists from reports and retrospectives, is that Cisco bought Linksys. Linksys outsourced certain chipset development to Broadcom, and Broadcom outsourced firmware development to overseas developers. Everybody up in the chain ended up with a lawsuit once people started looking. That looks kind of ugly right there, but the lawyers were happy. In any case, Cisco made history yet again in 2007 when it was first entity to be actually sued by the SFF over GPL violations, which started in 2003 and continued to come up with the new hardware products. Cisco settled the case with the FSF in 2009, making a donation to the FSF and appointing a free software director at the company to keep track of its licensing obligations. 6 years. I wonder if they paid a lawyer for a retainer for 6 years. Good heavens. Prior to the FSF lawsuit, the Software Freedom Law Center, the SFLC, boy, just love acronyms, had filed lawsuits against hardware makers on behalf of the creators of BusyBox, a collection of Linux command line utilities bundled into one tiny executable. Some settled, more were filed, and some defendants went bankrupt. At one point, a judge ordered all of one defendant's infringing HD TVs containing BusyBox to be surrendered to the plaintiffs. This writer would have linked the... Okay, they couldn't find a resolution of it, or they would have provided a link to it. In almost every case, both the Software Freedom, the SFLC, and the Freedom Soft... Too many acronyms. Both the SFLC and the FSF have stated that lawsuits were filed only after multiple attempts to seek compliance from license violators had failed. To this day, it does not pay to ignore the emails from the programmer and the questions about software licenses. And to any German listeners, I'm sorry I butchered your language. And to the English listeners, I'm sorry I mangled your language.
No worries. Yeah, I hope that the lawyer that they hired was a copyright lawyer and kept them busy and doing something worthwhile for several years.
Yeah, I don't know if I ever get back in touch with one of my nephews. He was. I wouldn't see why he wouldn't be anymore, but he's a copyright lawyer, and I know he had done work for Mars and some of the other confectionery companies in the country. So I'd be curious to ask him how that actually works, because 6 years. Surely they weren't litigating that entire time, and he was, or she was doing other cases. So I don't know.
Okay. Well, moving on to next story. Google and Linux Foundation form Chromium. Google and Linux Foundation form Chromium Love Club. While Google awaits a decision about whether it will be required to sell its Chrome browser trust remedy, has joined with the Lens project called Support Chromium-based browsers, the sustainable environment of open health of Chromium ecosystem, and financially support a community contribute to the widespread and continued progress of debtors. Explained technical program manager blog post. Jim Zemlin, executive director of the Linux Foundation, said the Browser Foundation support group much needed funding elements of open development of Chromium without specifying the source or funding. The Linux Foundation did not immediately respond to a request to clarify the funding arrangements. It understands that all the members will be funds. According to Shrikanta, last year made more than 100,000 code base, 94% contributions. Hope is their organization building their will step up their contributions. Chromium project has de facto standard browsers. Announced that it would release a version of Edge browser based on flying Blink engine, sunsetting Microsoft Trident engine. Chromium plus some proprietary features already has a market share, 68%. A figure made even more expensive. Chromium-based browser, Opera, and Vivaldi, others are included. The popularity of Chromium, testament to cost and technology, competing with monopoly-funded stable of software engineers, helps with web standardization, flips alternative technologies. Other browser engines or organizations jump on the bandwagon. Are presently 3 actively supported browser engines: Blink, Apple's WebKit, and Mozilla Gecko. A few niche or progress engines, Wana and Servo. Browser engines handle the parsing and JavaScript, such as V8 in Blink, JavaScript Core in WebKit, and SpiderMonkey Gecko. Apple has managed to make its Safari browser powered by its WebKit engine, second most popular market share, aided by self-preference platform. All iOS browsers in Europe anymore be built upon WebKit. It remains to be seen whether Safari maintain that position in the absence of platform advantages by Apple. Imagine that. You force people that buy certain hardware to run certain software, and that certain software gets run. Mozilla's Firefox browser, powered by a Gecko rendering engine, also not a part of the ecosystem, and its global market share just a 0.4% in December 2024, according has dwindled significantly. Chromium. Mozilla did not immediately respond to a request for comment of Chromium-based browsers, likely to those committed to the world. Quotes, Microsoft is pleased, which will help drive collaboration ecosystem, said Megan Perez, Edge in a statement. On to say this initiative aligns with our platform through meaningful and engagement in collaborative engineering and partnership. Everyone uses the web. Vivaldi CEO John von Etchner told the Register, "We welcome this effort and we support it. We have not signed up yet, but we will in the future. We have been in contact already. So if the Chromium gets stronger still, it could further diminish diversity." Web Rachel Neighbors observed in 2018, Chrome has the most recent back in formed to can't be sure if we're building one or the cool one. And sorry, John, about butchering your last name. A lot of consonants. Yeah. Guys got anything to add there?
We'll have to see how this stuff plays out. I mean, I'm still dubious as to whether or not any of that enforcement of Google is going to actually happen. I think.
Well, even if it does, it'll be a bunch of shell companies.
Yeah, I just don't. I'll believe it when I see it, I guess is the best way to say it.
Yeah, because like you look at the consent decree that AT&T had in what was that 1949, for when the United States government said you're too big. You need to be split up because they own the company that made the telephone poles. They own the company that made the telephone wire. They own the company that made the telephones. They own the company that made the telegraphs. I mean,
Right.
they
And they
own. I
owned
mean,
all the services involved with it.
yeah,
Right.
they own the long distance. They own um, the local. I can't remember what the technical phrase is, but the local business. And then, like, yeah, if you do the legal verbiage for the dissent decree is you do this list of things and we're not going to sue you and win, but
Mm-hmm.
if you do, you go ahead and we'll give you some time, but if you don't, then we're going to break you up. And that's when a lot of people think that in the 1980s, when AT&T was broken up, that was the first thing, they're thinking, oh, it's big government breaking up the big company. No, this was the execution of a dissent decree from 40 years before or 35 years before. And now look at them. I mean, Lucent technology has been handed over 2 or 3 times. And I don't want to get into the whole history because it's not pertinent to this discussion. I don't want to ramble on.
It's interesting.
But yeah, I think I agree with you too. It's either going to do some good or it's going to end up being other subsidiaries that after 10 or 15 years from now, everybody forgets and they get merged back into the company. Because I can guarantee you, if you go back and look at the track record of all the companies that AT&T has acquired, I bet you they were probably spinoffs that
Well,
from the 1940s into the 50s, 60s, 70s.
when it comes to phone companies, yeah, that's pretty much it. After the split, there were still only companies that were formerly AT&T, and then since then, has there really been a whole lot of new companies? Maybe one or completely unrelated. It all goes back. Splits off
And
again.
yeah, and where I used to live when I was renting a house, I lived on this corner, and it wasn't how many times they were going to hit this one telephone pole on the side street, or if they were going to hit it, it was how many times per year they were going to hit it. And the point of this little tangent is Spectrum would come out and have to restring the cable TV wires. And they'll come out and go, oh, we can't touch this pole. And it got to the point where they hit this telephone pole so often that they knew that it wasn't their pole. But the first couple times they came out and they're like, who owns this? Oh, Ma Bell. Because they were of our generation. They knew, They're like, yeah, Ma Bell owns them. I go, still? Yeah. Yeah, it's pretty much when they broke it up, they're like, who wants to maintain these? What are we talking about? Oh, about 1,000,000 telephone poles. Oh, nope. We don't want any responsibility. AT&T can do that.
Well, I think just in relation to wrapping up the Chromium story, like it's the de facto because no one else wants to spend that kind of money developing a browser because it's truly one of, if not the most complicated piece of software being developed today. For the desktop or for any product, actually, for any operating system. It is hugely complicated, takes a tremendous amount of resources, and because Google makes a ton of money off of having people use it because of all the information they can gather with Chrome, it's worth it to them. But no one else has been able to do that equivalent, development effort. So that's just sort of the de facto inheritance that they have of that. So, I'm old enough to remember when Firefox was the browser of choice because Internet Explorer was so terrible. And then Firefox got worse and worse and worse until when Chrome came out, it was like a breath of fresh air because it was so much better than Firefox was at that time.
Yeah, and then back and forth, because then for a while, Chrome would be
Mhm.
taking up all your RAM and it would be unusable, and you switch back to Firefox, and then Firefox,
Yep.
something would happen to make it brick, and back and forth. Yeah, and that's not an issue. But
And the
Right.
last
Exactly.
the last comment I want to make, and this popped into my head while you were talking about that. Even if they were to spin this off under its own, ecosystem, being its own profit center, are we just going to end up with another Mozilla that cannot make a profit because the browser itself does not generate the money, but the ads and stuff do? You know,
well,
Yeah. I mean,
there's always going to be some kind of web browser, even if companies like Google need to dump money into whatever company is making it. Yeah, there's always
Yeah.
going to be.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to security and privacy.
all right. So Microsoft, easy for me to say. Microsoft patches Windows to eliminate secure boot bypass threat. This is from Dan Gooden at Ars Technica and via Londoner. For the past 7 months, and likely longer, an industry-wide standard that protects Windows devices from firmware infections could be bypassed using a simple technique. On Tuesday, Microsoft finally patched the vulnerability. The status of Linux systems is still unclear. Tracked as CVE 2024-7344, the vulnerability made it possible for attackers who had already gained privileged access to a device to run malicious firmware during boot up. These types of attacks can be particularly pernicious because infections hide inside the firmware that runs at an early stage before even Windows or Linux has loaded. This strategic position allows the malware to evade defenses installed by the OS and gives it the ability to survive even after hard drives have been reformatted. From then on, the resulting bootkit controls the operating system start. In place since 2012, Secure Boot is designed to prevent these types of attacks by creating a chain of trust linking each file that gets loaded. Each time a device boots, Secure Boot verifies that each firmware component is digitally signed before it's allowed to run. It then checks the OS bootloader's digital signature to ensure that it is trusted by the Secure Boot policy and hasn't been tampered with. Secure Boot is built into the UEFI, short for Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, the successor to the BIOS that's responsible for booting modern Windows and Linux devices. Last year, researcher Martin Smolar with security firm ESET noticed something curious about SysReturn, a real-time system recovery software suite available from Hawyar Technologies. Buried deep inside it was an XOR encoded UEFI application named Reloader.efi, which was digitally signed after somehow passing Microsoft's internal review process for third-party UEFI apps. Rather than invoking the UEFI and functions load image and start image for performing the secure boot process, Reloader.efi used a custom PE loader. This custom loader didn't perform the required checks. As Smolar dug further, he found that Reloader.efi was present not only in Hawyar's SysReturn, but also in recovery software from 6 other suppliers. The threat posed wasn't limited to devices that had one of the vulnerable system recovery packages installed. Attackers who had already gained administrative control over a Windows device could simply install Reloader.efi and, because of the digital signature in the OS, use it to install malicious firmware during boot up. On Tuesday, Microsoft finally neutralized the threat by updating Windows to remove the signature. In 2022, security firm Eclipsium identified 3 prominent software drivers signed by Microsoft that could be used to bypass secure boot. In a post, Smolar wrote, "This raises questions on how common the use of such unsafe techniques is among third-party UEFI software vendors, and how many other such obscure but signed bootloaders there might be out there. We reached out to Microsoft about the situation, hoping it could bring more transparency into what third-party UEFI applications they sign so that anyone can quickly discover and report such obviously unsafe UEFI applications if they mistakenly pass or passed a long time ago, Microsoft's UEFI third-party code signing review. We believe that Microsoft's planned rollout of the new UEFI certificates provides a great opportunity to make this happen, pushing UEFI third-party signing transparency and UEFI security one step forward. ESET reported the vulnerability to the CERT Coordination Center last June. It's unclear why Microsoft didn't issue a patch until this week. It's also not yet clear if Linux systems were also vulnerable, and if so, whether a patch has been issued. Red Hat, SUSE, and Ubuntu didn't immediately answer questions sent by email. And there's a link to more information on this at Hacker News. Well, that's frightening. Basically, you know, a rootkit where, well, not technically a root, but it's basically something that's running, you know, prior to the operating system and isn't really something you could detect, and no sort of scanning is going to fix that. I mean, I would think maybe flashing a clean version of the BIOS might do something if you were to remove the offending entry. I'm not sure what the mitigation process is, but
Bill, that's a scary
it's not going to be
proposition all on
something
its
that's, yeah. Well, the signature part of it would help, right? If you still had that present and then the new signature requirement blocked that from happening, then I suppose that would then render it ineffective. But yeah, more fun ways to hack systems.
All right, let's move on to the bi-weekly wanderings. First up, me. I've been working a lot on the 10-inch planning and printing portion of it. Got a lot done. Not a lot got done on it since the last show, and I'll be getting into why shortly. I was able to print a couple of shelves and a couple of brackets for holding different items like which mini PC that I will hopefully be on order. Went through a whole roll of PLA between good finished products and failed prints and switched to PETG. Able to get a good print or two out of that, then it started failing. Back to PETG for later drying, and later drying and use, and switched to PLA. I was able to print for a while, and then it started getting cold outside, and I started problems with adhesion. Tried a couple of different settings to counter this. Off the cooling, and that did not work, and I ended up taking a few entirely. Getting the enclosure out and seeing that helped, but that would have meant staying in my cold garage. I was not okay with that. By it got cold outside, I mean to say that my part of Texas closed down again, snow and ice, drive. While not printing, I was looking to fix one of the other problems, the size issue. A lot of the prints were just too big for the bag. I grabbed a couple that I wanted to work on, modified Tinkercad. Previously, I had split them down the middle and gave them an overlap with offset and holes so that they could be screwed or glued together. For these new ones, although I have not printed to test, actually I end up printing. I wrote this. I think it'll be much easier to use across multiple prints. I rack mounting points off and did the same thing as above mounting point. Instead of at the middle, I did it for each side and rack it to mounts that can be printed separately. It actually worked really well. I did this for a 3-bay 5.25 inch drive bay that I then put the adapter into, or that I was then going to put in the adapter to hold 4 3.5 inch drives. And if it works the way I was thinking of ways of attaching a power supply to the rack and my DAS onto it, bulky tower cable. Then I realized probably not the issue. Once I was no longer in fear of my extremities falling off, I went to work troubleshooting. The issue, very much like heat reporting correct temps, is the reason I didn't think that it was the cold. After doing cold pull, I realized that my fan that cools the extruder and not the parts fan was stopping. This fan should be unless it is due to the cold, one of the assumptions that but I started wiggling cables, and sure enough, it would start and stop. First assumption was that it was my solder joint modular cables that I issue. I mean, that makes the most sense. I wanted to shorten up those cables and cable management anyways, took them off, redid them, pulled out the trusty voltmeter onto the Knoxville connector, and everything was fine. Started looking at where the wires go into the fan, and with wiggling them around, sure, ground cable was. I don't want to replace a fan that could work fine, especially a Knoxville, so I pulled out a lighter, light tension on the cable, I heated very tiny, very delicate tape later, and it was working again. This was caused by the hot end moving back and forth, bending and unbending those wires. Added a zip tie to the shroud that will hold the cable at the same angle. Hopefully, it won't happen again. Put all the cables back into place and zip tied them off to printing again. Sadly, I already ordered a new hot end and with heating element and thermostat. Also working on a couple of other projects. I think that last time I talked about converting an old laptop monitor, portable monitor, had the board all set up for it. This time I was able to create a mount and get the first one attached to my chair. I went through a couple of different iterations of one that slid on and screwed down and had a insert to fit on standard. This one turned out to be a little flimsy, scrapping it. Redesigned, and while I don't like one that part and maintain one, slide over the bottom bezel and had a non-heat mount since I wouldn't be able to twist the monitor to place. I designed it around being able to use thumb screw down. Yes, this had to be bezel, but I am much happier with the ability in the product. I will have to design a stand for tape. It is still currently attached to the garage, and I do cast decks to it, but I think that I will also use it in the setting up the server rack. I still need to reorder the controller board for the other monitor, but I need to take it apart first, model number, screen, and still need to figure processor off no matter what. I also need to decide if the next one is going to have the hinges all the way removed. They make things easier, more aesthetic. Dremel. I also pulled out my other Dell Venue 7140, 5 processor and mobile processor. I was able to find an M.2 NGFF hard drive for it in my collection, but it is only 30 gigabytes. I had stopped using it previously because I was out of extra key batteries, and the battery life was horrible. Processor. I've ordered another charger and another working keyboard. Battery didn't work on, and we'll see how things go. Hopefully with PowerTop performance. I noticed that it charges a bit slowly, but that's an issue with the long USB. Also, unlike with the other Venue, audio simply works after Mint. I like having both of them in operation. As needed, they need charge. Go along with a 1GX mini laptop. But I have to say, while the performance is much better on the 1GX board, is much Venue. And in regards to that 5 1/4 in the 3 bay 5 1/4 inch drive bay that I had 3D printed, I'm scrapping that, or at least setting that aside for now, because the adapter to hold 4 3.5 hard drives didn't work. And I found another resource for prints for 10-inch racks that just prints out the 3.5-inch drive holders and holds up to 6 drives. So I have that set up to be printed, but it is going to be a almost 48-hour print, and it is going to use roughly 700 grams of filament, which is, 3/4 of a roll. So I'll probably set that up to run sometime this afternoon. We'll see how things go from there. I'm still having wall adhesion issue. Increased line width, temperature. I'm not sure what the might just. Well, I did get 4 rolls of it, so I'm going to keep. And that's pretty much all that I've been up to. You guys don't have anything to say? What you been up to, Eric? Can't hear you.
I've not done much. Yeah, sorry. I just figured it out. Not much, at least in terms of tech. The one thing I've been doing is archiving some DVDs from the physical disc to a file, basically ripping it so that I'd have it available in my movie library, and trying to relive my youth to some extent by showing my daughter some of the like 80s and 90s teen oriented movies,
Like my kid's
16
entire
candles, like all that.
childhood.
Yeah, that kind of stuff. What's cool is like she actually really enjoys it. It doesn't feel like I'm forcing her to, partake in just nostalgia for nostalgia's sake. She actually does seem to enjoy it. All of the John Hughes type movies and stuff. Anyway, it's kind of neat to see her enjoying that. But the point being that using I have Handbrake to do that with, and it's a lot easier today than it used to be in terms of the software itself. It's just become pretty turnkey. But excuse me, the ability to just take a disc and set the style, or the parameters of how you want it to encode, and all of that's just sort of point and click at this point. And yeah, come up with a decent image. I don't need it to be like archival, so I kind of go mid level in terms of what I'm creating, and then have it available in I'm still using Plex. And yeah, and we've had fun just sort of watching things, and a lot of it's been sort of a cultural kind of experiment, because some of those John Hughes movies they've not aged very well in terms of like modern sensibilities, and there's a lot of like overt racism and sexism and just sort of misogynistic themes. And it's actually kind of funny to look at it now, where it's like, yeah, I guess it's still kind of funny because it's like kids running around being crazy, but at the same time, it's kind of like with the mood. The world has definitely changed a lot in 30 years. And anyway, I put in here about the TikTok ban, which is already not even a thing anymore. Less than like 12-hour TikTok ban, which I have some fun conspiracy theories on. Like, it was never necessary in the first place, and it was really just done as a show. Anyway, so it was basically just putting in there the idea that that's today's culture. My view of the world was television and movies, maybe magazines, that it was a very slow trickle of information versus something like TikTok or social media. And hard it. I have to imagine being young today would be much more difficult in terms of being able to balance, how much of that was part of influencing me, and what I'm doing, how I'm living my life, and what because that period of your life is so difficult, of trying to figure out who you are and what you're interested in and what your style is and all that sort of thing. And for me, a lot of it was just really the people that were closest to me, like my friend group. But today, that is a much larger group of people, basically anyone in the world. So yeah, very interesting. And I just kind of thought, well, if it's changed that much in 35 years or so, what's it going to look like for my daughter's children, if she even has any. It seems like kids now don't even want families anymore. So I know I sound like an old man, but it's just interesting to think like how much the world has changed in such a short time, and how much it'll probably continue to change. So that's all I've got. Deal?
Alrighty. get back up to my place here. Since I haven't been on here on a regular basis, I just basically picked some things I've been doing the past few months of last year. A friend who is also a Ubiquiti Unify fan like I am ordered a new gateway. Some refer to them as routers. There are some technical differences between them, though I will digress. The model he bought was the Gateway Max. I previously used their Gateway 3 port. It worked well, but it was limited to the amount of firewall rules and filtering it could do. And I believe I bought this around 2016, and I think they stopped selling them, I think, sometime around 2020. I can't remember. So I moved to pfSense, and I've been using it for like a year or so. I wasn't completely happy with it, only because of the Unify devices are all centrally managed. Trying to do things like VLANs is a bit of a pain. And what prompted me to go to pfSense, other than my curiosity, was the fact that while I was away at work, something ate the Ethernet port on the Unify 3 or the Gateway 3. So I don't know what happened, because it didn't harm the modem that it was plugged into. So I don't know if it just burned out or what the problem was. Well, after my friend's raving review of the Gateway Max, I was compelled to buy one, because why not? I hadn't bought many brand new tech items in 2024, so I thought I would end the year with a worthy upgrade, because I haven't really bought a whole bunch of stuff this past year, though I can't seem to stay off of eBay for smaller things. Ubiquiti greatly improved the functionality of their gateways. It is a night and day difference. They are now on par with others in their league. I was also surprised that it supported 2.5 gigabit. That would be nice if my cable provider ever increases their speed past 1 gigabit. I'm very happy to be 100% back on Unify with the single pane of glass management, as they call it. My other new tech purchase of the year, for well, not this year, but 2024, was an iPad Air 11-inch. I've been curious about iOS for a while. I know I've chatted with Leo on the various Telegram channels about the differences between iOS and the Android. My previous 3-year-old Android tablet is a Lenovo Yoga Smart Tab 10-inch. It started having Wi-Fi issues and other odd glitches. It would connect and have no internet access. This was on either my phone or my Peplink mobile router. The YouTube app, history, and the Spectrum TV app would just stop. No error, just black screen, or a frozen, like I paused the playback. And reinstalling them didn't help. Clearing the cache didn't help. So it's been about a month since I bought the iPad. It took some adjustment because the gestures are different. You don't realize how accustomed you are to doing certain things on your device and then not have them work. So a friend who has an iPhone helped me get up to speed. It was refreshing learning something new. I felt like a new user, which was kind of cool. I'm really impressed with the sound and the camera quality of the iPad. I use it mostly for Skype, Zoom, YouTube, the History Channel app, Science Channel app, Spectrum TV, which is my cable provider's app for watching TV because they got rid of their cable boxes. So now we've got these little, they're called Xumo boxes, XUMO. They're like a Roku. So I can actually watch TV when I'm away from home now, which is kind of cool because before you were limited to restreaming past content, and now I can watch the Weather Channel from the inside my truck. So it's pretty nice. And speaking of my Peplink Max Transit Duo Pro mobile router, don't you just love these product names? Takes you 5 minutes to say the name of it. I've had it for about 5 months, and I must say it is my third best new tech purchase of this past year, 2024. Though I think it's my favorite next to my iPad. The mobile router has a significant improvement in my mobile data access. Places where I had no service with AT&T or Verizon, I had service with my Peplink. The plan I am using has access to AT&T, Verizon, and US Cellular through mobile must-have. It's a NVM acronyms. NVMO out of, I think they're in Massachusetts or one of the New England states. I can't remember. They cater mostly to the campers and the what they call those people that work from their RVs and stuff. The mobile or what do they call those remote office worker type people. Well, between the AT&T and Verizon US Cellular, which covers most of the country, of the continental United States at least, it will only use one carrier at a time, so I can't use, all three. There are other models where you can, and it's called bonding connections. So you could actually have AT&T, Verizon, together. They also have it so that if you're a Starlink customer, you can actually use your Starlink as another source, and it pretty much does all the magic sauce of how to route it and where to route it. You can have and the more expensive models, which I didn't want to pay for because, ouch. They can do live failover and some other fancy things, and this is also something that first responders and people with set up ecom emergency communication outposts would be using, so that they could set up multiple computers. You plug in the Ethernet to a switch, and you can have multiple computers. And it also has built-in Wi-Fi. And see where I left off. There are still dead spots in the country. You'd think after 40 years of cellular technology, we would have covered the country by now, but apparently New Mexico hadn't gotten the memo yet.
Yeah, I can picture those places in New Mexico that don't have any type of cellular or, people.
Yeah, and truck stops, they take up dozens of acres. And that land's expensive, so they put truck stops in the most remote places where, like you said, no people, no service. One of my things I'm going to do this year is get an external antenna for it, because right now I'm just using the paddle sticks that attach, to it, and they've been working, but they've told me that if I get, even if it's still inside my cab, if I get something that has another 10 dB, 12 dB gain, it would be much more. But that's going to be another $200-$300. So I'll just have to consider that, because my goal this year is to pay off my credit card and my car. Then I'm done with credit. Learned my lesson. Let's see what else. Some other technical details here. Oh, my yes, thank you. My carrier, since I get a discount because I'm already a customer of Spectrum, I'm using the Spectrum Mobile, and it's intended for people who don't use their phones. I mean, if you're around town and everything, I mean, we're the outliers here where we need 10 and 20 and 30 gigabytes of data. Most people can get by with 5 or 10 gigabytes because they're basically doing YouTube shorts and stuff while standing in line. So it's not a big deal. But for me and others like, Joe and possibly Eric and Bill and everyone, we may need, more ability for that. So I wasn't really concerned about the service because what I did was Wi-Fi calling. So when I'm in my truck, I use the PepLink as my Wi-Fi hotspot or for calls. And you have to set that up in your phone so it knows, to do that because it's not going to do it by default. If it's carrier locked, good luck. Go on to Swappa, go on to whatever website you want to, buy a carrier unlocked phone. You'll thank me. Trust me. I wish I would have done this earlier. There are so much more features in the capabilities of the phones when you don't have a carrier locked phone. And one of the benefits is you can do things like this where you can tell it, yeah, I want to use this Wi-Fi connection as my phone service. And there's only been a couple of times where I've actually had garbled text, or not text, but garbled voice. Otherwise, I can be driving down the road 70 miles an hour and using Wi-Fi calling. Because it's going through this cellular network, obviously. And I already mentioned the benefits of not having a carrier-locked phone because they have it set. Now, I'm not going to be an apologist for them, but they lock it to what their service can use. The only problem is their heavy-handed approach to it. And that's all I'm going to say, so I don't ramble on about that. But your carrier-locked phone can access more than what the carrier is letting you access, which is why I suggest getting a carrier unlocked phone, or what they call here in the United States an international phone. Now, my PepLink, this gets into the little weeds here, so you might want to do your own DuckDuckGo, Google Foo type things to learn more about this, is that my PepLink uses Cat 12 and Cat 7 LTE cellular bands. And these are basically the frequencies and what data throughput each one of these frequency bands can support. And since we've gone to no more voice, your voice is going over data now. It's basically VoIP traffic. That's why sometimes when a person on the other side say you're roboting, but you can hear fine, it's because there's two bands, sending, receiving. So you may be receiving them fine, but your voice going out may be a little munged. So you may have to hang up and call back. Now, the 5G model that's above the one I have, it's much, much more expensive. It wasn't a factor of, oh, it's only like, another $100, another $200. No. You don't want to know how much more it was. Trust me. Unfortunately, I wasn't too impressed with the 5G on my phones that I've had, so I opted for the LTE PepLink because it's also less expensive, because it's older technology. From what I'm told, the 5G is much better with the PepLink, so that is my future upgrade path. But it's going to be an expensive upgrade, pretty much like gaming laptop price type, or iPhone price. So that's going to be not for a while, but that's what I've been up to. So if no one else
Now,
has any questions or comments,
I do want a lot of your modern carriers will allow for Wi-Fi calling. T-Mobile has Wi-Fi calling built in as long as running a phone that
okay,
is
that's good to know.
possible. Like my S24 Ultra, I have mine set because at my office work, there's basically no cellular signal in there. I have Wi-Fi calling turned on, and I am connected to their Wi-Fi, but I'm running wire. All right.
I've also not thought that 5G was anything special. Honestly, I think LTE is more consistently fast. 5G, you'll get boosts and bursts where it's like, yeah, it'll be fast, but not for very long. And then, like, the slightest disruption, or if I've also noticed if I'm sitting in traffic and there are like hundreds of other people around me, that it doesn't seem like it handles saturation very well. Like, it just gets overwhelmed pretty easily. So whether that's just the technology isn't as flushed out as LTE is, but I would much rather, like, I wish my phone would just let me turn off 5G, because
Yeah,
Yeah,
I would rather just use LTE and be done with it and just not care about 5G.
when LTE phones LTE, they allowed you the ability to turn off LTE
Mm-hmm.
because
Yep.
LTE would get saturated if places.
yeah, I
Well,
miss that.
yeah, while 3G was slower, you'd at least be able to connect and get things done. And the problem with
Exactly.
5G, well, 5G isn't as much of a standard as it should. A lot of the problem 5G as far, like physical distance, basically anything in the way will stop it. It's non-penetrating, short distance. It's is significantly faster if you can connect to it. Once again, saturation issues and the fact that it doesn't go as far and block it. Yeah, it does make it, while a helpful solution as it's taking things off of LTE, not a that this
Yeah, the
No, I
only
know,
thing,
but yeah, go ahead.
no, this brief. I watched some really technically in-depth YouTube videos on this because when I was making this purchase, which was not cheap to begin with for this Peplink, but I wanted to make sure what I was getting into. And basically, the long story short, to let Eric get in, is 5G, like Joe said, wasn't wasn't well implemented. And what it is it's actually a set of multiple standards because you have the microwave band, and then you have the traditional cellular bands. And one was intended for stationary site to site microwave, and then the other was the LTE type, 600 megahertz, 1.7 gigahertz, whatever they are. So yeah, it it needs a few more minutes to bake. So go ahead, Eric.
No, I was agreeing with Joe that maybe that could be something for
Oh
another
yeah,
day.
another innards. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it's a long conversation. It's been a while since I studied the topics. Go back and read. But that sounds like that's the end of our bi-weeklies. Moving on to Linux Innards. And in this Linux Innards, we're going to be talking Docker and containerization in general. Um, we're hoping that Bill was going to be here, and because he's more of a Docker expert than the rest of us, but he had some issues come up and have had to tweak it a little bit. Thankfully, Dale was able to jump in. Thank you, Dale. And we'll be continuing this talk. I've actually done a lot of preparation for this, just in testing things, and I was really glad we're getting. Now Docker is a containerization system getting a little long in the tooth. The company has had its ups and downs with trying to monetize, and it seems like every time they find a good monetization path, someone kicks it out from under them with lower cost, better open source, such as when they came out with Docker Swarm, which was supposed to be their way of making money at the time. Kubernetes just came in at almost exactly that same time and really just took that possibility away. Now, I used to use Docker a lot for things, Flex, and an odd setup using VPN and Chrome, and a torrent tool, and separate from those, Subsonic and Librasonic instance, which I used to audiobooks and podcasts. Now, Librasonic was a good application, audiobook itself that I'm using now, but with all the subsonic forks, it was difficult to keep track of what was still being maintained. And I stopped using Docker. I got tired of the. Granted, that's just pulling and launching. It wasn't so bad with most things, but again in Chrome, there were so many updates in itself, and other two attached. I was having to weeks. It got annoying. So moved to installing Barebones, a lot more stable. But since I knew we were going to do this different, test out, I installed Portainer, which allowed me to Portainer and Docker Compose to file. Portainer is great. It allows me to create multiple, link them together as needed, plus update them with just. I don't know how this compares or that. I'm enjoying it greatly. Also, I understand that I can install something like Watchtower, which will automatically do the updates for me as well. I've set up Jellyfin, Orca Slicer, Jupyter Notebook, FreeCAD, and even an instant bookshelf. I'd also tried Cura, but I couldn't get those to. I also need to finish setting up the volumes for Jellyfin and the slicers, so I don't have to get creative with files around, access it. All of this Docker also makes it very easy to back up an image as needed, or to deploy a second one with slightly. I haven't really needed that. I could use it with an manually port map. Really easy to compose, and Docker Compose just so much more easy online. Also, I'll have all my old notes. I'm going to move my old Docker command and Chrome, and I'm try and translate the Compose file, see if they still work in a modern environment. I have had trouble getting that Chrome instance work because it does use. And as a further test, I wanted to install a full OS. And for my test, I decided to use Chasm Web, pre-built and ready to go. I had to install, and their password not being set as an environment variable. After dropping to the command line for the Portainer password, I was able to get in. As in, I did not use Compose for that. It's pretty cool, and it comes, but you can't install any of your own. Yes, care that they would boot. With one of my own, I could mount the /home and local, and I could make a startup script. All these things, settings. So I am looking potentially app image bounded volume, as long as all my volumes were correctly, that should work pretty well. It's just suitable have the app image stored on an attached volume. We'll see how that goes. But I also kind of want to move like the other set of nerds and test out Proxmox and then do a comparison with LXC and Portainer instance and see which one I like better. So that's been my experience the last couple of testing. Docker Compose really makes it a whole lot easier, especially if you wrap your head around environment variables, goes up, the volumes and goes up. And Portainer is great for showing you where or what ports things click right there, and it locally on another computer change the address, but that's not ports how you're accessing. So it's been interesting so far, and I have been able to from my phone use Orca Slicer from Chrome and get an image sliced, and then using my Octa print, I was able to start a print. So slicing and printing from my phone with no issues using my computer garage. I'm really enjoying it, and I think Docker has greatly improved since I quit. All I gotta say.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I've just put down some thoughts that I have. I mean, Docker just is sort of the way of things, like containerization. It's the way software is developed, deployed, managed, maintained, and it's just sort of this phase of IT in general. So, I was starting to write down, and I'll finish it for the notes, but basically, I had a 20-year IT career, and when I started, everything was on premise, local machines, local servers, local workstations, running backups, and then taking the tapes off site. And like that was just sort of the operational model. Then we switched to this sort of more centralized, central office and central sort of like pre-data center methodology where things were connecting over networks. And because the networking had gotten so much better, that was really what allowed that to happen. And so then from there to that centralization, then you started getting into virtualization, where you were taking advantage of powerful computers that could do more than just run a few small processes. They could actually run slices and be, divided up into individual servers, virtual servers. And that was how we were managing, applications and development, and everything was sort of running off of a virtual machine. And I had sort of gotten out just as we started to shift into containerization before, right as Docker became a thing. And it took some time, time to ramp up, Docker as a mature enough technology, and also not just the technology, but the sort of methodology and everything that went along with it. The idea of DevOps, and there's just IT has sort of like shifted in a lot of ways. I mean, we're doing sort of the same things. We just keep extracting it or pulling it, abstracting it, different layers. And so, I don't think you can kind of do much on servers today without having to at least sort of touch containerization in some way. It may not be your preferred thing, and you can still run, a bare metal server. There's no reason why you can't, but it's hugely expensive usually if you're doing that. Virtualization is still kind of like the next step, but even then, on a virtual system, you can run containers and orchestrate software that way. So what made me start to use Docker begrudgingly because I really didn't understand it was certain software that I wanted to use it was a suggestion or a requirement that you would use containers, use Docker, because that's just how they published it. And so it wasn't like you could just take the source code of the project and run it on a server somewhere. You actually had to have it as a Docker container. And so that's what made me start using it. Specifically, the first one I started using was Discourse. It's a user forum software that a lot of people are probably familiar with. It's really great. There's a lot of features to it, but it's also built from a lot of like modern web stacks and technologies and multiple Docker containers, and it's hugely complicated to someone who doesn't understand the underlying technology and how sort of Docker operates. And so I had a lot of problems with. Seemed like every time I had to make any simple changes or I had to make a configuration change and then restart the Docker containers and or run an update. I always had problems with it. And I think that early experience, and it's probably as much the software's fault as it is. And to be fair, Discourse started as more or less a collection of just young, I would guess young and also inexperienced people in the sense that they didn't understand how to run a project or publish a project, and more or less made it work, if for lack of a better way of saying it. And then other people showed an interest, and then it became, instead of spending a lot of time on packaging it and making it so that other people can run it easily, it was just more or less, well, here's what we did and here's how we do it, and these is the 50-step instructions you have to go through to get this thing working properly. And so each update was very fragile because of that. And so I think that turned me off early to Docker containers, and the fact that you're running the container engine, and it has a certain amount of interactivity with the kernel and the underlying operating system, and you have to sort of connect all the things together. So there aren't just inherent connections to like networking or storage or other things. You really have to like plan that out. And Docker Compose does make that easier because it's more or less like a playbook where you can look at a Docker YAML file and just Docker Compose YAML file and look at specifically like what is being brought in terms of other server software. Here's a database component, here's a network, here's how the network's configured, and you can easily sort of see that all in one place versus just sort of Docker itself. You have to use commands and sort of know which commands to run and where to get the information from. And then I think Docker Compose does make that a little easier to orchestrate. And then of course, because it's become a much more mature technology now, there are graphical front ends and things that make running it and using it. Portainer, I think, is probably a good example of that, where you can orchestrate multiple containers. And I know Bill, if he were here, would probably talk about Hightower and being able to automatically update software. And the power of containers in development and deployment being such that it's just the software itself or the server component itself, the Nginx, web server, or the MySQL database server. And, those can be individual components that you mix and match. And if you make a mistake or you want to start over, you literally just, pull in a new version of deploy a new container, and there you go. And then if you have a configuration file, or if you're using Docker Compose, it's just going to pull in everything it needs and all the configurations. And so it's very repeatable, and regardless of the underlying operating system. If you think about orchestrating software releases and installation on individual servers, those individual servers have to have all of the dependencies in place. And so the advantage of containerization is that you can bundle all of the dependencies with the software. And so it comes as a unit, and that makes it more repeatable, supportable, easier to sort of manage and maintain and deploy, versus, that individual deployment per server. And so, I mean, I totally get why it's as popular as it is. I guess I still fall back on my old ways whenever I just think it's easier for me to do things bare metal or even as a virtual system. Because I still see those, especially a virtual machine, as being fairly disposable. I can set it up the way I need it to be and then take a snapshot. And if I need to, I can just roll back to snapshots. Um, it's a little less direct, a little less specific. But I think the backlash that I've had is it's kind of like, that whole hammer and nail thing where if you have a hammer, everything's a nail. And I kind of feel like that Docker sort of became the darling, and everything now has to be containerized. Everything now has to exist in this way. So even software where it didn't really make sense to run it as a Docker container, to have all of that overhead that's necessary to run Docker as a local daemon on your machine, and the permissions it requires and the overhead it creates and all of that stuff, it just wasn't necessary in a lot of cases. But because it was the way to do things, or the way that most people wanted to do things then, or the popular way to do things, let's say, that just meant that it then got pushed into, I mean, I can almost, and this isn't the exact analog, but I can almost say it was like an AI type thing, where like AI is being thrown at every possible solution right now. And, Docker, when it came to software orchestration, like that was the case as well. Like, oh, well, we could put this in a container, and, even if it didn't necessarily make sense to do so. And I think that was my pushback was, well, I'm running something that's a personally hosted system, or something where adding containerization just adds complexity that I don't really need. And so I'm not going to do that. Like Nextcloud, for example, the recommended, I would say the easiest way to deploy it is as a Docker container.
Oh,
Um,
I'm
Good.
going to agree with you. I mean, there are a lot of applications ran better and didn't need the permissions provided by Docker. Everything it does. So yeah, I can definitely. And
And
I
fortunately, recently there's been a better option for me. So Red Hat, and I'm not sure exactly what precipitated it, but they developed Podman, and it's an alternative to Docker, and it has a bunch of key differences, mainly being that it runs more or less as an executable on demand in user space. So it's not a daemon that requires elevated system privileges and therefore, deeper integration to the system. It just kind of runs when you need it. And also, it's doesn't require root privileges to run the containers themselves. So again, you can be running this in under your user account. And also, I mean, so to run Docker, to make it easy for yourself, you can just add yourself to the Docker user group, and more or less you sort of undo all of the security protections. One of the points of containerization is that you are abstracting this application away from the underlying system, and therefore the security benefits would be that it's things can't reach outside of the container to get to your system. But if you were to add your user to that group, then of course your user now has privilege to do things that it shouldn't. Anyway, so it's basically a reverse effect. If you add yourself to the Docker group, you more or less become like a super user by default kind of thing. But anyway, so Podman sort of makes that a little bit easier. And I haven't really been doing much from a server perspective in terms of self-hosting or doing things with Docker, but I have been using DistroBox, and DistroBox is used on a lot of like composable slash immutable desktops right now, where that's the way to, if something doesn't run in, let's say, as a Flatpak, you can run snapshots or containerized versions of Linux, and then be able to run apps within those containers and then run them on your main system. And so that's a way to get to software that you couldn't get to because of the way that immutable systems work. And so that relies on Docker or Podman. And so I've been using Podman for DistroBox, and seems to work just fine. And so I'm by no means an expert on using it. I was more or less drugged forward into, and like I said, kicking and screaming to some extent. But I mean, I get it. It's I understand the whys and the hows. I don't know the specifics in a lot of cases of doing it. You know, when I was doing software development, it was not, using containers. So it was, again, much more around virtual machines. So it's not the most comfortable technology for me simply because I didn't use it as much. But, as Bill has shown, a relative novice with some technical acumen can get in and kind of be dangerous enough to put some things together and have it work, well. And, and it has implications for backups and things like that as well. It can be pretty straightforward to just, create a snapshot or backup of a container. So in terms of running, especially self-hosted stuff like he's doing, websites, Nextcloud, that kind of stuff, like it can make life easier. And I'm pretty sure he's using Docker Compose for most of that stuff. So, yeah, that's pretty much everything I've got on Docker or, um, that type of technology. How about you, Dale?
Well, I'm new to the whole Docker ecosystem. I got to dive back in to, take two, because I've always been a command line ever since the DOS days, and learning how to type back in the 80s, and GUIs weren't that common. You basically would start Windows and play solitaire. Everything else, you would do everything from the command line back then. So I have a friend who's in IT, likes doing everything with the GUI, and I've been trying to get him to do more things with the command line. And it's a generational thing where he wasn't taught how to type. Now we're in the era where my friend has some grandchildren that were never taught how to do cursive. So we're kind of in an interesting thing here. And he said, well, try TrueNAS Scale. It has a Docker implementation and it has an app store where you just go and click and it will pull down the compose file and start the service. You don't have to do the Docker compose or anything because it's part of the package that you just click to install. And that worked fine, worked great when it worked. When it didn't work, and I've used this phrase before, you end up with a weird science project because you can get the log of what happened, like a little terminal window, and it'll show you what's flying by, and it'll say, yeah, this failed, this failed, this failed, this failed. Docker not deployed. And I'm like, great. Okay, that makes perfect sense. And you can sign into the container to get any logs or any, make any changes or anything like that. But at that point, you're defeating the purpose of the GUI. And I know there are some technical restrictions about how good they can make a GUI where you don't have to go to the command line. And so I mentioned this as a caveat emptor for people, that if you don't want to do the command line of the Docker and everything, it would serve you better to learn the commands and how to do it on the command line so that when things do go pear-shaped, you at least have an idea of how to fix it. Because that's where I was at. And it was more of searching through all the forums and everything. Like, I have the error message, I know what happened. And then you have 7 different ways of fixing the problem, and none of them fix your problem. And people are like, oh, you're using Scale. Well, ask them, because it's the way it's implemented. Because we spoke before the show started about the different implementations of Docker, and I could have some of these wrong because, like I said, I'm still learning. But it was like Podman and other ways of implementing things. So I had success with Plex, but Nextcloud, because it's starting up a whole bunch of I can't remember if it was MariaDB or if it was MySQL, but it was one of them that it was loading up, and it's thank you, Joe. MariaDB, and it's loading like a whole bunch of stuff. And if one of those doesn't work, it's not going to run, and Docker is going to give you an error. So another thing that I've been playing with is, if you have like Ubuntu server or RHEL, you can install a thing called Cockpit, which is a web GUI. It's just like TrueNAS Scale, and it's a project from Red Hat, and you can install it, like I said, on Ubuntu as well. And they have plugins, and you can have the Docker plugin the same as the ZFS plugin, where it will do the ZFS create, and the zpool list, the zpool, all the other commands like that. It's the same thing of the Docker and Docker compose type nomenclature. And that's more of a point and click. But I still say that you should learn the command line terminology, because when these GUI systems don't work as advertised, you need to be able to get in there and to figure it out. And my friend who knows Docker, he tried to help me with the Nextcloud, the Nextcloud Docker on Scale, and he even had problems. But he's told me since they came out with the most recent version of TrueNAS Scale, they completely overhauled the Docker system. He was kind of ticked in a way because it wasn't a clean install. You had to export your settings, wipe, reinstall, and re-import your settings, and then delete the imported Docker stuff, because you had to recreate everything. But ever since everything was recreated, he said it's been fine. And one thing that he has done that nobody else has mentioned, and I'm not sure if Bill has ever mentioned anything like this, is he's used LXC containers. We're not going to I don't really know enough to speak intelligently on them. I just know from what my friend has told me. They're another form of container, and they're more kernel-based, where
Direct access to the kernel.
Yeah, it's basically a process on your Linux host. It's not a container, but it has protections through C groups in the Linux kernel for what processes it's allowed to access, what processes it's not allowed to access, in file systems that it can't access. It can get pretty granular. Now, one thing that he did with the Docker for portability, because in his actual job, he's a storage administrator, and they're managing exabytes of ZFS pools and running virtual machines for the scientists that do the research on these machines. So if a cluster goes down, they can move a VM to another host, and they can keep running, take that node down, do whatever they have to do to it, move things back over. And it's live failover systems. Really, cool stuff. And
I work
he
with
does this at, huh?
live failovers, multiple
Yeah,
nodes, places, the planet. And yeah,
yeah.
it's really cool when something happens in one location. Automation that drop the one, bring up the next, as keep going like nothing happened.
Now he does this at home. He has a 3 cluster Proxmox. He bought some of those Dell, almost like the
SFFs.
yeah, like these. It's like the Think Center type Dell, the Wise terminals, and I think HP has their own incantation of them. And he actually has his Plex and his other self-hosted services in VMs running Docker. And you want to talk about portability, about deploying Dockers. You have 3 instances of this VM in a cluster. If one of them goes down, you can move it by failover. And he's tested it, and he was, oh, I could hear him, hours away from me, screaming at how excited he was about this. And that's something that if you really want to get into um, Docker, is they do the VMs because they're portable. It doesn't care what the machine is. It's virtualized hardware. And Docker doesn't care. It just needs to see a Linux host or a Mac host or a Windows host, whatever. But you could run that VM on a Windows host. You can run it on a Mac host. You can run it on a Linux host. So that was kind of cool about the how he does Docker. And
That's actually one of the really cool things about containerization in general, is and just being able to take whatever's in a container, and as long as the proper abstraction layer on whatever place you're taking it, you toss it on there, it works. It's out of the
yeah. Now, since we wanted to expand the content here for the show, and because Bill is the guru of the Dockers, they had to uh, hunt and find something else. And I had mentioned in the Discord team chat for mintCast that they have been using snaps on a Ubuntu server just to try them out. Because my friend that I spoke of, earlier, he had tried them and he went back to Docker, but he wanted to try them to see how they worked. We're geeks. We want to find out how things work. And so I was, licking my wounds after my Docker experiment, my first time. And I started using it, and pretty much this is what I've learned to help someone else if they're not ready to learn the intricacies of Docker, or if you have really simple needs, nothing like what Bill does with the multiple instances of not multiple instances of Nextcloud, but multiple instances of services that are running on the same machine, with reverse proxies and everything. It's much more flexible when you have Docker. Now, like I said, I've been using the Ubuntu server for like a year. If you're not needing to do any like numerous configuration options of Docker, snaps are a good thing to get your feet wet with containerization. If you're used to using snaps or Flatpaks on your desktop, it's pretty much very similar on the server. You just have a few extra commands. Now, the confinement of the snaps, because the confinement with the Docker is something you control. You set up everything, and it's basically like its own little Linux host in that contained file. Well, in snaps, the containment is controlled by kernel patches that Canonical maintains. And it's obviously in their kernel. And you'll see people complaining about snaps on the desktop. Like most recently was Ike Doherty from Solus, saying that they weren't going to have snaps as a first-class citizen on their distro because of the 60 plus patches that they have to put into the kernel every time a kernel updates. And this is for the confinement of what the snap is able to access and etc. Now, the snap itself is dependent on the person that creates it or the team that creates it for file access. And it's pretty much not much more they can do because of the confinement that Canonical had built into the Snap system, because it was initially intended for IoT and server work. They rolled it into the desktop use for whatever reason, they had. Now, for example, I use Plex and Nextcloud. For example, Plex Media Server Snap uses the home folder of the user that installed the snap. It is a folder I created during the installation process of the snap for Plex, and is owned by root and the group of root. And actually, this is a ZFS pool that I have mounted under my home folder on the server. So it disappears that it's coming from my home folder, but it's actually, pointing elsewhere to for Plex, for example, that's my RAID of SSDs, Stripe, if you want to call it in the old RAID parlances. And that is the only thing it can access. That's how they have theirs set up. You couldn't have it off the root folder. You had to have it a folder under your home folder. And it works fine. I mean, even the little glitches and stuff I did when I was using it on my Debian box for the permissions, the snap, not to be funny, but the Plex snap was a snap. It had a web GUI they go through, told it where your media was, how you want to sign in, if you have Plex Pass, all the, requirements and all that. And then you just click install and it's done. I haven't touched it. It updates all by itself. I have a script on all of my machines. It's a bash script that does the updates, runs the package manager, and it does the file system trim for the SSDs and stuff like that. And I just do that on all of my machines. I just type update and go along, update and go to the next one, and have all these, terminal windows and go to the different computers I have. I'll look at the snap and it's like, it's up there. I'm like, I haven't touched that thing for a while. I sign into it. It's the current version. So that's what I have to say about Plex. Now, Nextcloud, on the other hand, isn't limited to the user's home folder, with an exception, and we'll get to that. My Nextcloud storage is another ZFS pool, and I have it mounted at /MNT, and I call it storage 0. Now, as far as Nextcloud's concerned, this is the root folder. When Nextcloud sees /root, this is where it's looking at. and everything that it creates is off of that folder structure. Now, that's the excuse me. That's the exception is you can put it wherever you want on the file system, but Nextcloud itself is only going to see anything created from that point forward. So it's not going to see anything past the other root folders. Now, if you need the Nextcloud Snap to have access to apps outside its containment, because it can only execute what's in its snap in its own virtual Linux environment, except for the folder it's physically executed from in var, because it's executed instead of user/bin or user/sbin like regular binaries are. Snaps and flatpaks are executed from the var folder. Var flatpak, and then there's var snap. Now, if your Nextcloud Snap does need access to another binary, another application, they need to be placed in /var/snap/nextcloud/bin. For example, a thumbnailing utility that automatically creates thumbnails for videos and images that you upload needs access to FFmpeg. And it can execute that from the folder I just mentioned because it considers that its bin folder is in its part of its root because it has access to that. And there's some other exceptions, or examples, I should say, of why you would need something outside of the confinement of the snap. But I only say, one other thing, I had this SSH thing open to my server so I could read the command here. If you type in sudo snap services, it will list all the services. Like on mine, I have the LXD activate, LXD daemon, LXD user-daemon, Nextcloud.apache, Nextcloud log rotate, Nextcloud MySQL. There's dots in between all these. Nextcloud cron, Nextcloud fixer, PHP FPM, Redis server, and renew certs for certification for the let's encrypt stuff. Now, they interact with these. It's pretty much, if you're used to using systemctl, it's a systemd's daemon service. It's very similar to that. You just type in sudo snap start, stop. I lost my place. Start, stop, restart, and you can see the logs, and then you put the name of the snap. And in order to get the name of the snap, you just copy the name from the services. So if you wanted to get the logs from Nextcloud.apache, you would do the sudo snap logs, Nextcloud.apache, and it's automatic. But if you want to force an update, all you have to do is just type sudo snap refresh. Now, the caveats I know that Bill would be pointing out is you're not going to be doing what he's doing with snaps. Just forget about it. Because the Docker is much more flexible in that you can go in and tell it what port you want to use, what IP address this one is. With my Nextcloud and my Plex, they're on the same IP address, only separated by a host name. So I have to type in the host name to differentiate it from the IP address. I can't just type in the IP address because it's not going to know where to go. I'll get the default Apache screen saying, "Hi," you know. So, where do you want? You know, what do you want? What do you want me to do? So that's pretty much the limitations of the snaps. But if you just want to get something up quick and just do something just to, have something for yourself, and you're not needing to do any of the remote access and I mean complex. You could do remote access with the snaps, but I'm saying if you're not wanting or needing to do complex things like what Bill was doing with the reverse proxies, with having multiple websites going to multiple IP addresses and everything, then you have to pick Docker. But snaps, I just wanted to give a little shout out to Canonical because I know I give them crap about snaps. All of us have given them crap about snaps, but I really have to commend them for the functionality of the snap service on the servers, at least. So that's all I have to say about that.
Is there anything anybody wants to add about containerization in general?
Nothing that's occurred to me. No.
All right, then. That sounds like the nerds. Move on to vibrations from the ether. There is none. He loves us. Send us an email, mintcast@mintcast.org. Try to respond. Moving on. Check this out. Now, Dale included found interesting and partially used innards .com/blog/advice comparison. Okay, moving on. Housekeeping and announcement. Thank you for listening to this episode. Something that you'd like to hear about, tell us. Email at mintcast@mintcast.org. On YouTube, post at the Mintcast subreddit, Telegram and Discord, or post directly at mintcast.org. All those links are in the show notes. Please feel free. Next episode, 2 p.m. U.S. Central Time on Sunday, February. Film with the link in the show notes. Next roundtable live stream, 2 p.m. U.S. time on Saturday. Show notes to get the time zone. Next roundtable live stream, 2 p.m. U.S. Central Time on Saturday, February 5. In the show, converted time zone. Live stream information is at mintcast.org/livestream. And to wrap up, like the sound of my voice, I'm Joe, and you can catch me on the Tech Show, TLLTS.org. Catch me on the Blogcast with Eric, or you can send me an email directly, jb@mintcast.org. Boss wasn't able to join us today. He's taking a bit of a hiatus, but you can catch him on Full Circle News, boss at bodhilinux.com, on Mastodon at Zyvala at Hostux Social, and a car link. Bill had an emergency and wasn't able to make it today. You can send him an email directly, bill@mintcast.org. He's Bill_Discord at WCHauser3.org on Mastodon. Also, check out his other 2 podcasts, Truckers, show notes. Majid decided to take another vacation and is in Morocco right now. You can send him an email, doctor.org at social and threads. And he has the Eric?
I simplify things. You can just reach me at eric@mintcast.org. And if you insist on trying to find me elsewhere, I usually just use my name. So Yep. Is currently filling it in on the on the notes because we forgot to do it earlier. But what's
Yeah,
the best way to get in touch with you?
Mine's I'll just make mine's simpler too. My online name is Dale_CDL, and you can find me on Telegram and Discord, and you can email me at Dale_CDL@pm.me.
Okay, before I want to make sure to acknowledge some of the people who make mintCast possible. Bill for our audio editing, archive.org for hosting our audio files, logo, NetRD animated Discord logo, Eleanor for our time sinks and various other contributions, news, Bill Hauser for hosting the server, which website maintenance, and cloud server, host our show notes and raw audio. Along with that, we'd like to thank the Linux Mint development team and distro to talk about. Thanks, Clem.
Thanks, Clem.
And
Thanks,
Co.
Clem.
And that's a wrap.
It's a
Thank you
wrap.
for everybody that listened.
Absolutely. All right, I'm going to stop the recording.